And just to go back to the I don't know, will we be dissecting more of the Apkalus. So again, do you agree like that these things match what we see as watchers in Genesis 6?
I think it's a mix. I think the Apkallu could be the Watchers. I could also see if we're assuming that there is a real presence behind people like Enki, Elil, Ishtar, that those could be the Watchers as well. There are other spirits that are clearly not in line with Yahweh. And so they're in there again. I think there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors going on to this stuff too. I think there's some spiritual stuff where they've revealed a certain amount of their character, but they've probably also hidden some. So I hesitate to completely identify them the same way. Um, yeah, but and there also seems to be generations. Enki and Enlil are sort of a second generation of God after Apsu and Anu. Um, and then Marduk is said to come after that. So is this the Watchers and then demons? Are there other principalities in between? The generations and hierarchy there isn't clear, and I'm not sure it's supposed to be clear, other than maybe more common to people is Greek mythology, right? You got sort of the initial creation, and then you've got the Titans, and then you've got the Olympians. The same sort of thing is going on. But if we assume the Titans and the Olympians, and then the later demigods are all kind of there, how do we identify them with the Watchers, right? It's that's a tricky thing to me. Um, yeah, I will say this because it's related. We have one writing from the Second Temple period in fragments. It's called the Book of the Giants. It seems to be related or done in the same style as things like the Book of Enoch. And one of the reasons I bring this up and want to bring it to people's attention is that it's in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but flat out, the Book of the Giants say that Gilgamesh was a giant. He is in there. And so, almost 2,000 years later, because the Epic of Gilgamesh goes back to about 2,500 BC, maybe the Second Temple stuff starts around 500 BC. It could be even later than that. But this idea has remained and was important enough to be written down over 2,000 years later. And so that's why I'm kind of bringing it to the light, because I think that there's stuff going on in the background, even if the Bible is not directly referring to it. And that's why this is important.
Yeah, I just wanted to read one small paragraph, which is a part of the paper which I, wrote um, for one research
Yep.
paper. But here I'm including in this quote Dr. Amar Anus, who I don't know if
Mhm.
he's a Christian, but most of us who are, biblical nerds and following the work of Dr. Michael Heiser, we have
Mhm.
heard of Dr. Anus because his work on the ancient Near East religions and mythologies is very important. Again, I don't know his spiritual status, and in this context, it may not be very important because he's approaching to this as objectively as possible as a scholar. So even Dr. Heiser and some other Christian theologians are quoting the work of Dr. Anu. So I just want to read a few sentences, which back in the days I wrote for my paper. In his research of the Mesopotamian context of the Watcher's narrative, Dr. Anus compares biblical Enoch with King and Meduranki and argues that theologians in general agree that these two characters could be the same person. In the ancient Mesopotamian writings, Apkallus were called the sons of God, and Nephilim or giants were their children, which seems to flawlessly match Genesis 6, verses 3 and 4. Gilgamesh was one of the Apkallu, and according to Dr. Anu's research, they were punished by a flood according to the Era epic. In First Enoch, the flood was considered to be the final judgment for the fallen angels, combined with the punishment of fire. as Apkallus are sent down to Apsu. I think this is abyss. The watchers and their sons will be led away to the fiery abyss and to the torture and to the prison where they will be confined forever. I don't have to read the whole passage, but um, I was very interested how Dr. News helped Christian theologians to connect the dots between
Hmm.
biblical narrative and the ancient other ancient Near East narratives and find similarities, even though like you said, maybe we're not completely sure if these are the
Hmm.
same things. But it's so interesting, even with different names coming from different nations. Not just the creation stories that may have some similarities, but flood stories are so similar. But also the fallen angels and the Apkallu or the watchers, call it whatever you want to call, or the
Hmm.
giants, and God judging them, or their main deity judging them. It's so fascinating to me because in the minds of many skeptics and atheists, they'll be like, "Oh, the Bible stole from there," but rather, for me, over the time, this thought pattern changed. No, like I see all these civilizations writing what they're witnessing,
Hmm.
and then combining these writings, and as long as these neighboring countries were either having war with each other or trading or having intermarital relationships, for me it's perfectly normal. And the only logical things that also some of their faith traditions and religions and beliefs would mix and be they will influence each other inevitably. So for
Hmm.
me, seeing all these flood stories, or seeing all these giant stories, or seeing this thing with watchers just being called in different religions, they're not necessarily stealing or copying from each other. They're witnessing and living in the same time, in the same era. So they're witnessing the same thing, just using different names and nouns. And for me, that's fascinating, because it I don't think, oh, these people stole from these people, but rather, this just confirms, but by having different sources, that what Bible is saying, is true. So for me, that's very comforting.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because the Air Epic kind of says that Gilgamesh is an Apkallu, or hints at that, but the King's List says that there's Gilgamesh and then he has an Apkallu, right? So, and I think there's two ways to look at that. There's kind of the common, I would guess, the anthropological explanation that, this stuff was talked about and passed on and kind of changed like a game of telephone before someone wrote it down. But then you get these different written versions because of the verbal tradition. There's probably a little bit of that going on, but the ancients were better storytellers and kept better details than we did, as far as we can tell, right? We've got other things that we can write down, use our phones even today. So I'm just not completely convinced by that. I think it also actually completely ignores any real spiritual world. And so this is where, again, I think there's a little bit of a game of smoke and mirrors going on where, depending on how people responded to, let's say, the influence of the Apkallu, eventually in a lot of the stories, they lose favor. And so are they trying to change the story and influence people and kind of twist it about as well? Which, given that they're tied to, he's not an Apkallu, but in the stories, actually this comes up in the Numa Lish later. There's a guy named Kingu who kind of takes over. He's called a demon prince, like flat out, but he becomes the consort of Tiamat, and then he's kind of in charge of some stuff before Marduk comes back and kind of pulls him out of power. So, how much do you trust someone that's called a demon prince? And I think even in the ancient world, that was not a good thing, right? So, yeah, we'll have to cover that maybe in another piece here. But I'm trying to grab the big ideas. The fact that we get oh, First Kings 22, where there's the divine council scene about how Ahab will be disposed, right? That's all going on, and you have this spirit that's going to be a lying spirit in the tongues of the prophets, like to me, that's the Apkallu. That's that same principle, is that there are spirits that can influence and are talking to people, and it's not an angel or Yahweh or the devil directly. There's other things at work. And I think I would tie those principles together more so as sort of a divine council kind of thing, and some of them being loyal and some of them being rebellious more than the watchers outright.